asked for that, and so I hope everybody's okay with that. I don't think the recording tends to pick up the conversation in the chat area, but it'll certainly pick up everything that's being said, and we hope to be able to. I'm sure that this will be widely viewed, the recording of this session, by colleagues, and I'm sure that we'll be able to host it on the school's webpage in a way that everybody can see. So anyway, I'm not going to take too much time other than say welcome to Victoria Okoye from University of Sheffield. And Victoria is a co-author is the author working with Patricia Noxolo on this report, which I certainly was aware of when it was published, and the RGS IBG, who were a sponsor of the report, publicised it really widely about supervising Black geography PhD students in the UK. So I'm really pleased to hear you talk about this report today, Victoria, having read through it, and I hope it'll really bring it to life and relate it to us. And as I'm sure everybody knows, this is something that, like many geography departments and other schools that have cognate departments, in our case, we've got environmental science and archaeology in our school too. And the sorts of issues that you're going to talk about are really relevant to us, and ones that, you know, I'm sure many people share my view that we want to learn more about this and to hear about your findings and some of the sorts of good practice guidelines that you're going to talk about too. So thanks very much for joining us today. It's good to see you all here, and Victoria, over to you.
Awesome, thank you so much. So thank you so much to all of you. Thank you to the School of Archaeology, Geography, Environmental Science at the University of Reading. Thank you in particular to Alice Mpofu-Coles for facilitating this intervention and even this space today. So as has been said, my name is Victoria Okoye, and I'll just be talking a bit about this research project and the report that I've undertaken with Dr. Patricia Noxolo. So I'll just say first that, you know, this was a small research project with funding that Dr. Noxolo, she's a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Birmingham. She gained this through the Ray Y. Gildea Jr. Award, which is from the Royal Geographical Society. And this award in particular seeks to support innovation in teaching and learning in higher and secondary education. And the idea is that the outcomes of this grant and the grants that they give should directly benefit students in geography. So in a way, this research project, which is focused on supervising Black geography PhD researchers in the UK, in a way, this research project is tailored to the supervision experiences, and we can imagine that this research supports both present and future Black geography PhD researchers. And the attempt is to document, to raise awareness, to raise discussion, and identify best practices in our supervision. And obviously, what is outside of the scope of this research is that we ourselves will be working with supervisors on their own practices. So it's particularly important and valuable, this invitation and this space today. I hope that these experiences that I'll be sharing with you can generate some rich, thoughtful discussion and also reflection, not in terms of providing evidence, but more about thinking about within your own school, within your own departments, what can be done to support current and future PhD researchers, particularly Black PhD researchers in geography, in the ways that they can be supported, that their knowledge and research can be nurtured to support a more expansive future for geography at the University of Reading and in the UK. Next slide, please. So that was quite a long intro, but I do want to really start by situating myself. As you may have noticed from my accent, I am not from here, not from the UK. I'm a Black woman, I'm Nigerian American, born in the US. I'm an international student here in the UK. I'm currently completing my PhD in urban studies and planning at the University of Sheffield. And I've started just working part-time. I started working part-time as a lecturer in human geography at Sheffield Hallam University. And you know, it's 2017 that I started my own PhD, and I actually started at a different department at the University of Sheffield. And it was actually in 2020, which was my third year of the PhD, that I changed for supervisors and I changed departments due to supervisory issues. So this kind of research is actually, I feel like it can often be a bit, you know, I could say it's near and dear to my heart, but it's very much linked to my own experiences and the challenges of supervision and what it requires to actually change in your third year to change your PhD. But I just want to point out that it was the support and friendship of other Black PhD researchers, other Black academics, in particular, individuals like Alice, that were really critical to helping me to navigate my own situation and navigating the PhD. So I just wanted to start with that. Next slide, please. So this research is essentially centered around two major questions. The first has to do with what are the supervision experiences of Black PhD researchers and Black supervisors in geography? And then what are Black PhD researchers and supervisors' recommendations for best practices, especially because these supervision experiences are not always good? What are the recommendations for best practices toward improving these supervision experiences? Next slide, please. And so in order to do this, we undertook a research methodology that involved 10 semi-structured interviews. And so this was interviews with current Black PhD researchers. These are individuals who were of British nationality, of African nationality, individuals who were, even the Black British were, for example, Afro-Caribbean or African. This involved interviews with a Black early career researcher, as well as 3 PhD supervisors. These interviews were all conducted. Someone says they can only see the first slide. Maybe I can definitely share the presentation, or the presentation can be shared afterwards.
I can see the correct slide, so
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
it
great.
seems to be working
it
okay
might
for me.
just be a bit delayed.
Awesome, cool, great. So all of these interviews that were conducted, these were done online. Obviously, this is during the pandemic. We're still in the pandemic, but during the lockdown. And so these interviews took place during the months of April and May this year. And the interviews lasted anywhere from about an hour to 2 hours. And I just want to point out, just as I've shared with you my own experiences, these interviews were not just about asking individuals about their experiences, but me also sharing my experiences. And so we were finding ways to share across our experiences and better understand each other as we were navigating these questions within these interviews. And the questions all focused on whether for the researchers, the PhD researchers, or the supervisors, all of the questions centered around the overall supervision experiences, experiences of race and racism, based on their locations and positionalities, the different aspects of the PhD process, everything from when they were applying to the PhD and searching for funding, their current position within the PhD, writing, preparing for their research gathering activities, writing up, looking for future post-PhD career opportunities, and then finally looking at recommendations for best practices on supervision. And I just want to point out that when it comes to the recommendations, I just asked them, what do you think can be done? And all of the recommendations that come at the end are those that were provided by these individuals. So I'll just follow the presentation in this same format. Next slide, please. So what I'll be doing as part of this presentation is, it's really important for me not just to recount and tell you these are sort of generally the learnings, but to try to personalize this a bit, because I'm recognizing these are all individuals with their own experiences, and I'm trying to find a way to also include their voices, at least some of their voices, within this presentation. So as I'm doing here in this slide, I'll be sharing some of the direct experiences as they vocalize them, these individuals. So one Black British PhD researcher said, when it comes to just initiating supervision, when I approached potential supervisors, they didn't take me seriously. I had to go through multiple PhD applications. It was only after successively applying and gaining funding that I was taken seriously. Next slide, please. And I just want to use that to introduce, and also this next slide, to really introduce both the PhD researcher as a potential applicant and the supervisor's experiences about how initiating supervision often takes place. So this PhD supervisor said, I always say you have to get distinction in your master's, and this is in order to pursue a PhD in their department at their university. I've noticed here a trend in particular departments. I don't know, maybe it's unconscious or not, or conscious, but these students will get marked 68 for either their overall assessment or for their dissertation. 70 is a distinction. And it's really interesting how many Black students get 68 or even lower, even though they want to stay on to do a PhD and the department knows. I've looked at their dissertations and I'm really taken aback, and I've just said, I don't really know the marking conventions in your department, but as far as I'm concerned, this is really good work. And then I have to make a case to my department. Next slide, please. So I think these quotes really set up for us the challenges that PhD researchers come across when they are trying to look for supervisors, connect with supervisors, and apply to PhD programs. So for many of these PhD researchers, as you can see from these quotes, the process of selecting a supervisor and applying to a program starts well before they begin. So as I've said, as I showed in one of the quotes, one Black British PhD researcher talked about how they went through several rounds and they experienced not being taken seriously. And when it came to approaching various supervisors with their PhD interests, they talked about how they attended a Black in Academia session on Supervision Experiences, and they learned two things. They learned better approaches to identifying and connecting with potential supervisors. Essentially, they talked about how they learned the unwritten rules about how this is supposed to be done here. And they also learned about the importance of, and learned to consider that maybe it would be better if they approached Black supervisors, because this was something that was central to the work that they were interested in doing. One individual talked about how they identified a supervisor because they were widely recognized as a scholar in the discipline, and why not work with them? One person talked about how they connected and they met with the supervisor, and when they met with this person, they just felt like this individual really understood their work and was genuinely interested in their work. Others talked about how they connected with potential supervisors at conferences. Two individuals talked about how they had initially worked with their current supervisor during their master's level work, and then they continued that relationship into the PhD. An individual talked about how they actually started a PhD program and they left because they weren't happy with their experience, and they subsequently applied to and started a PhD elsewhere. Next slide, please. So all of those experiences are really from, the experiences of the PhD researchers and the early career researcher, now to shift a bit to the experiences of the supervisors. So as I showed in one of the quotes, one supervisor talked about how there are actually a lot of students that they encounter who are interested to stay on from their masters, but noticing this trend where the Black students seem to not be given distinction, even though when this individual looks at their work does seem worthy of distinction. So already, in some ways, this is precluding these students from even being considered to applying for PhDs. One individual who's a supervisor talked about how within their department, they've been in their department for many years, and that they've never been approached by a Black British PGR to undertake supervision. And in the time that they've been in this department, there's never been a Black British PGR. There have been African PGRs, but not Black British. One individual talked about how they've been a supervisor as well for many years. They've been an academic for several years, and they've noticed that a trend where within their department, even though a potential applicant will reach out to their department and express their research interest, and that person's research interest almost perfectly aligns with this potential supervisor, that within this department, all of these individuals seem to be filtered to other individuals. And this includes Black potential applicants as well. And that what often happens for this individual is they're treated as a backup. So they're not often approached to be the first supervisor, but then if someone leaves the department, an academic leaves the department, then the department approaches them to say, oh, can you take on this person? Potentially this individual is already in their second or even third year. So that already shifts the ways in which they can support this individual. It becomes more about helping this individual to finish up their PhD, as opposed to having the time and space to work deliberately with them to conceptualize and think analytically about their work. Next slide, please. So here's another long quote, but I think this is really, really important. This is a quote that when this person said this to me, I still sit and think about this. So this is a Black British individual. So they said, me and my mates, we talk and we share information through a stream of consciousness. So we just talk, man, and you're reasoning, right? You just reason, boom, 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 you're speaking. That's a form of knowledge, man. That's a form of epistemology, but it's discarded because I don't speak in that way, because I don't speak in that kind of way that you kind of have been trained to speak. I'm not allowed to think like that, but we're still doing the same thing. Your PhD is supposed to be something that you do, but you can't really talk how you would write. You have to write in an academic way, right? Very narrowly. So you think, well, on one hand, you're telling me to do me and be reflexive, where the next minute you're telling me I have to conform, and that is conform to the academic conventions of writing. Which is it? And ultimately, what matters is the conforming, because these people have the stamp of an impartial PhD, right? So it raises questions about the diversity of the academic voice, right? And so the academic voice is essentially, like whiteness is invisible, so white voice, right? But our forms of knowledge, young Black people, we create other forms of knowledge that are not considered canon in inverted commas. So for example, like spoken word or poetry and all these kinds of things that we do are forms of knowledge too, that say stuff. It's not considered canon. So our PhD, until we write it and get it stamped, it's not official knowledge, man. And I think the supervision needs to have that kind of flexibility. And this person is talking about to consider all of these forms of knowledge as valid. Next slide, please. So I think that's a really excellent segue into thinking about supervision experiences, the actual experience of being supervised and how one navigates the development of their research projects. So while some individuals feel really well supported in terms of the practicalities, in terms of getting direction on trainings, preparing for field work, getting writing and getting feedback on their writing, individuals talked about how they have mixed experiences when it comes to some of the essentials like pastoral care. So one individual who has a Black supervisor expressed gratitude for having a Black supervisor. And they said, it's almost like you can talk about experiences and they've been through similar experiences. One individual who also has a Black supervisor talked about how they experience a very professional relationship, a very distant relationship, and they don't feel like they can talk about these kinds of experiences. All the different ways that they sort of navigate the PhD process, but also, as I'll discuss later, issues of race and racism. One individual talked about how their supervisor, who's very high, who's really intelligent, has really established in academia, also has an approach of sort of really closely managing the PhD process. This individual talked about how they feel this robs them of their agency within their own PhD research, and talks about how they were brought in to work on a project. And while this is really fantastic for their academic trajectory, they were worried that they felt they were brought into this project because of their positionality. One individual talked about how their supervisor stole their work, published it, and when this individual went to their department to make a complaint, it was swept under the rug. It was actually known in the department that this is how this individual operates. Some of the individuals talked about the ways that they have to navigate the power dynamics, especially where the supervisor has an intended research trajectory in mind, that you have to really tread carefully when your supervisor wants you to follow a particular path and you want to go in a different direction. One individual talked about their own experience of having extended lack of support from their supervisor, and then the supervisor suddenly decided that they didn't want to work with them anymore, in the way that this really threw their own PhD project into, it made it really difficult to just continue their PhD project. Next slide, please. Here's another extended quote, but again, I think it's really important. This individual is talking about their experience within the upgrade process. I think in different universities, we talk about this as an upgrade or confirmation review. I think maybe there are other names as well. And this individual said, the questions that I was being asked, I felt those were not the same as the questions that were being asked of a white male counterpart who would be interviewed at a similar time. And it felt like the people who were on my interview panel, initially they expected me not to know as much as I did know. Then, as the interview progressed, it seemed like they were like, oh, okay, you're good, you know this stuff. So I just felt like that assumption that you're not given the benefit of the doubt, possibly because of your background. I was just comparing. If I didn't have the direct comparison with my colleague who was white and male, I might not have been as aware of these things, and I might have thought, oh, they're just innocent questions. But sometimes, even the way that the questions were phrased, I felt trivialized the work that I was doing. And then another instance, I was asked why I had to bring up the fact that I was a Black African woman, and if I didn't feel like I was just politicizing it, when we should try and keep these things, that is the PhD research project, as neutral as possible. And I felt a little bit targeted because that white male colleague was doing interviews with people of other races in his research, and he was not drilled as much about his positionality, when obviously his positionality is something that even gave him power to those spaces and access to those people that he probably wouldn't have had if he weren't white. Next slide. Thank you. So now I have a couple of slides, or a few slides, where I want to talk about all of the questions and the points that came up in terms of race and racism. So one individual started out by saying that being Black is important to everything that I do, from their experience moving through their the PhD, moving through their university, the PhD process, just generally, being Black is central to their experience. One individual talked about how there is this irony of human geographers in particular who are researching things like poverty and inequality, that there are so many white geographers doing research in places like Africa, but yes, so few Black geographers. And that's so few Black geographers here in the UK. And I think we're all aware of the dearth of not just Black geographers in particular as a discipline, but also in terms of Black academics in the UK. So individuals talked about the lack of representation. They talked about the lack of representation of Black PGRs, and some talked about the lack of brown PGRs in their departments. They talked about this, the felt experience of this in their university environment, and the ways that this was isolating, that this was alienating, that this was demotivating. So one individual who's Black British, for example, who's of Afro-Caribbean heritage, talked about how within their department, within their university, that there are Black PGRs, but almost all of them exclusively are international students and they're African students. And seeing the ways in which these research trends shape both the researchers who are coming, but also the possibilities of the research, such that there seems like there's not really an interest from this person's perspective. They were perceiving there doesn't seem to be that much of an interest on, for example, on the Caribbean, where where this individual is from, but that there is all of these interests in terms of, African geographies. And what does this mean for an individual like her, who's Black British, born and raised here, but also feels isolated within their own home university? One individual talked about the way in which they're operating in predominantly white spaces, and they talked about how these are spaces where anti-Blackness is etched into the walls. And this individual was talking about the histories of geography, the histories of universities, the histories of our canons, the way they are westernized, as felt experiences that you can't escape this. One individual talked about this experience of being the token Black in the room. So being the only Black person in class sessions, and then discussions on Blackness come up. Blackness is discussed as objects, not as subjects, and having to hear their peers' unconscious biases because of this. We live in this atmosphere where there's supposed to be free academic debate, but for this individual, having to listen to these conversations and these ideas where Blackness is being objectified is actually a form of violence. And for them, this is an institutional experience of racism. One individual talked about how difficult it is to navigate showing up as your whole Black self in predominantly white spaces. One individual talked about constantly feeling oversaturated, that there's news coverage of anti-Blackness out there in the world, both locally and globally, while this individual is researching with and for Black communities and thinking about theoretically navigating anti-Blackness. Next slide, please. So there are all of these ways in which these individuals are navigating interpersonal and structural racisms that also impact their research and their emotional well-being. So individuals talked about how the commonality in the everyday experiences of covert racism, that it's stressful and it's confusing. As I showed in one of the quotes, individuals talk about trying to assess their experiences by comparing it, if it is about comparing if this is something that would have happened to one of their white colleagues. Individuals talked about how the overt experiences of racism are painful and destabilizing. In so many instances, this came up in terms of writing and language. So for example, one individual talked about the way that supervisors have criticized a Black African PhD researcher's writing. A supervisor talked about how the co-supervisor was harshly criticizing an African PhD researcher, and this co-supervisor was wondering if the criticism would have been nearly as harsh if the PhD researcher were white. Already I've shown you the quotation of the Black PhD researcher who talked about how the ability to communicate, the ability to write within academia is already constrained because the way of writing that this person wants to do, it has to be in this particular voice that is not their voice, and having to contort themselves in particular ways. But then requiring this, you go through in your PhD, your upgrade process, your confirmation review, you go through your Viva, that all of these processes, you have to move through these processes. So you have to contort yourself in order to get the PhD. And this PhD is often considered quite impartial, but is it? Next slide, please. So individuals talked about the ways in which when they encounter these microaggressions and macroaggressions, how they try to navigate this. Some of the individuals talked about trying to pursue ways of reporting, ways of making complaints about their experiences and the various barriers that they came up across. Individuals talked about that there's confusion in terms of where, when they experience racism, where can they report this? Individuals talked about the difficulty in terms of the need for evidence. If you've ever had a racist experience, you know that most individuals are not going to put this in an email. Sometimes that happens, but sometimes it's an interpersonal experience. Sometimes it's things that people say that leave you sort of wondering, wait, what was that? And it really becomes difficult to sort of place that as, oh, this was 100% that. And so when you need this evidence to sort of prove that this is what happened, it becomes incredibly difficult or impossible to do that. Individuals talked about even when they do find ways and pursue making their complaints, the ways in which their attempts are dismissed, or the ways in which departments or individual supervisors or those in power seek to handle these issues informally. So one individual said that as soon as, when you want to make a complaint, as soon as they, you bring this to your department, as soon as they say, oh, let's handle this informally, that nothing is going to happen. One individual talked about how this entire process, having to report, needing evidence, the ways that it gets dismissed, makes them second guess their experience. And so when it comes to navigating this environment, everything that I've talked about thus far that has been shared, the tokenisms, the covert and overt racisms, the gaslighting that takes place where you're speaking to your experience and it's being dismissed, your attempts to report and they're thwarted, that all of this takes away from the time that you would be investing into your PhD research. I think we're all aware of the time limits that are imposed on us in terms of how long we have to finish, sometimes 3 years, 3.5, 4 years. And what this means is that this takes away from your research time, your personal time, and your self-care. But oftentimes it forces you to make decisions. One individual talked about, I had to make a decision. I had to decide, was I going to try to make this complaint or was I going to focus on just finishing my PhD? And so individuals talk about the emotional toll that this takes, that it's frustrating, it's disorienting, it is incredibly emotionally depleting. And that, as I said, that this impacts your research progress. I think if anyone has gone through any kind of personal struggle or challenge, in your life, and then you're trying to at the same time work on your PhD, it's incredibly difficult because we're living beings, but we're thinking, feeling beings. It's not always possible, if ever possible, to really separate your emotional experience from what you're trying to do. So all of these things are impacting our research progress. Next slide, please. So when it comes to anti-racism inclusion, this is one important quote. So one supervisor said, "For me, you can't tell me that we're an inclusive department and anti-racist when there's only one Black person in your department. I've never come across a Black British PhD student in my department, so it's all international students of color. So that tells me that your process can't be inclusive on racial lines because I'm not seeing the people coming through. When they think of inclusivity and EDI, that is equality, diversity, and inclusion, the first thing that comes to mind is gender. That's what they gravitate towards, and for them, gender doesn't mean Black women. So I would say they're inclusive in certain ways, but in terms of race and racism, for me, the reality and rhetoric is different things. While I think there is an anti-racist narrative, it's not being reflected in the reality of the things that I'm seeing in terms of staff and also PhD students." Next slide. So one of the questions that came up in the interviews was, essentially, do you consider your department to be anti-racist and inclusive? And so one individual talked about how they consider their department to be inclusive just by the nature of the fact that it's geography, and geography is a generally inclusive discipline. And this individual said they haven't personally had any racist experiences. A number of individuals talked about how they consider their departments to be inclusive towards white women, but not anti-racist, and generally feeling that the work is left to students themselves to advocate for improvement. I think there's also been research that has shown that initiatives such as EDI and SWAN disproportionately support white women, but not other individuals. So there is inclusivity happening, But from these individuals' perspective, it's not supporting Black individuals, it's not supporting Black PhD researchers in particular. Individuals talked about how there are emerging anti-racist narratives and initiatives like Black Lives Matter. There's movements that have expanded globally. There's now an increasing academic interest in decolonizing. But one supervisor said that universities essentially are not equipped to support students in their experiences with racism. And that individuals talked about how there's a lack of representation in Black academics, that is, those individuals who could be potential supervisors, and that this is an outcome that demonstrates lack of commitment to anti-racism. Next slide, please. So now I want to shift toward the best practices that these individuals shared, both the PhD researchers and the supervisors themselves. So individuals talked about that it's important to recognize that the Black PhD researchers are individuals who arrive to the PhD through various routes, not all of them traditional. These individuals that I spoke with are coming from different nationalities or coming from different life experiences. Some of them are parents with families. They have their caregivers. Individuals talked about they are maybe middle class or working class. Individuals speak a range of languages, not just English. Individuals have had successful careers outside of academia and then have come to academia. So individuals, and so they're coming as mature students sometimes. These individuals have had a range of experiences. So it's important to understand where your Black PhD researcher is coming from and to get to know this person as an individual and a whole person. And this includes outside of their academic roles and interests. When it comes to applying for the PhD, for many applicants, the PhD, both the application and the scholarship process, but the scholarship process in particular remains unclear. There's already research that shows that disproportionately, Black PhD researchers are the ones who are working part-time, who are self-funded in order to complete their PhD processes. So this is very much reflected in what was coming out in these discussions, that the scholarships process is incredibly unclear. Individuals talked about how I didn't understand the scholarship process, so I basically just, I didn't apply for scholarships, or I only applied for a couple of scholarships because I didn't know how to navigate that process. So when individuals are approaching you about an interest in pursuing the PhD, it's so important to help them to try to understand the scholarship process and the timelines and identifying funding processes also during the PhD as well. Individuals talked about not being able to get that much support from their supervisors, and they said that supervisors should try to not take on too many PhD researchers if they're not able to give them the support and the time that they need. Next slide, please. Especially when it comes to these experiences of race and racism, it's so incredibly important to acknowledge that Black PhD researchers live and they're doing their research in an environment that is structured by racial inequalities and discrimination. This includes within the department, within the wider university, within UK academia, also sometimes in the places where they're even doing research potentially. So it's important to recognize that this is something that, individuals cannot escape. They're always navigating this, and it's important to acknowledge this. So it's important to listen to your Black PhD researchers and give them the space to make their voices heard. Don't dismiss their experiences and their complaints. Recognize as well that there are politics and power dynamics that are always surrounding the supervision relationship, and understanding that you as a supervisor, if you're a supervisor, have a lot of impact on your Black PhD researchers. I think we can recognize the way that UK academia is structured such that you really depend on your supervisor, other established researchers to really connect you with opportunities, to write letters of recommendation, to help you establish your network. So the role that the supervisor plays goes much further beyond just reading your PhD thesis and helping you along to develop that. Recognize the hierarchical and unequal environment of academia, including that you as a staff member in your department, as a supervisor, have much more power and should be advocating on behalf of Black PhD researchers, and this includes applicants as well. I think this is very much embodied in one of the quotes that I showed in the beginning, where a Black PhD supervisor talked about the ways in which they have to actively advocate for Black master's students just so that they can be considered for the PhD. Next slide, please. And it's important to actively engage with Black PhD researchers about their career aspirations as an ongoing discussion. to not make assumptions about what they're interested in doing, to constantly be having this conversation with them and helping them to position themselves well for the post-PhD. It's incredibly important to nurture Black PhD researchers as emerging geography scholars. I've mentioned, and I think we're all aware of the dearth of Black geography academics in the UK. As we look around our departments, as we look around the UK and wider universities, those individuals who are pursuing their PhD are the future geography scholars. And it's so incredibly important that they're supported. As well, it's important to support Black PhD researchers in creating their own supportive intellectual communities. I know that in my own experience, this has been pivotal for me. The ways in which, supporting Black PhD researchers doesn't have to be just extended to a supervisor's, their own expertise, their knowledge, their networks, but helping them to create their own intellectual communities. So for example, one supervisor talked about the ways in which they help their supervisees strategize which conferences that they're going to be presenting at, and to really try to set up them for networking with other Black academics to help them prepare for the future. Supervisors talked about, in particular, it was really interesting because all of the supervisors that I spoke with, they talked about how they have informally found ways to pick up and learn skills in order to support their own Black PhD researchers. They've learned this from the ways that other academics have modeled this. They've learned it from having conversations with other academics. They've learned it just through the process of supervising. And that there needs to be some sort of training. There needs to be first a recognition that that a lot of supervisors don't have this capacity or skill set, and that this skill set needs to be developed. And so training or support in order to help supervisors to be better attuned to helping Black PhD researchers. And then finally, one supervisor mentioned that it's something like the research councils and universities need to build in firmer accountability for how well academics are supervising their PhD researchers. We're all aware of the ways in which research councils and universities really keep track in terms of supporting PhD researchers in terms of, for example, how long it takes them to finish. Have they finished their PhD? But not necessarily always taking into account the quality of that supervision experience. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you so much. I think it would be really nice to sort of open this up to questions. Maybe not even necessarily about this research project, but I would love to hear more about sort of, are there particular things within your department or within your school that are taking place? To what extent does this reflect some of the experiences that are taking place, the ongoing conversations? What could be done as well within your school or department? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you. Wonderful presentation here. I think we'll just go to the flow because I know Steve has to go very soon. Just to find out if there's anybody who has got questions or you want to pop them on the chat, or just lift up your hand, and then it can be just a discussion, as Victoria has said, that for everybody to come through and come up and look at this holistically. Thank you.
Gundula, I see Gundula, you have a question.
Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation, and I'm not a geographer, and I got a lot out of that. I did wonder, and Tom made that point in the chat. I completely agree. It's a problem, sort of having the right voice and having the right words is a problem. But what do we do? It'll take a while, a long time to change the culture, if at all, if that can be changed, and to what extent I would think I'm failing my students if I don't sort of recommend them that they change the style in which they write to something that is more, I don't know, acceptable, just because for their own careers, that will be important, because changing the culture would take longer than they have to establish themselves as scholars, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Can I go ahead? Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Thank you. And I've also seen Tom's comment about finding it challenging to know whether to edit PhD research, to alter the style, or whether to keep the original style. You know, as someone who, I would say I'm a native English speaker, I struggle a lot with this. I think sometimes I want to say that I think a lot of times when we're talking about voice, we can talk about voice. Sometimes we're not always talking about things like grammar, but we're talking about what is sort of acceptable or valid ways of expressing your engagement with the world, your research, that sort of thing. And for me personally, I think I am really pushing up against, and I don't know what this will mean for my own future, but I'm really pushing up against this idea that I need to write in a particular way in order to make it in academia. And for me personally, I think I'm getting to the point where I'm like, if that's the way that I have to write, then I'll go and find some other space where I can write the way that I need to write. Because I think that we have to move, personally, this is my personal belief, we have to move away from trying to push people to fit into a system that we know is not structured well and is deeply exclusive, right? We have to find ways to push to make it our make other PhD researchers, make our supervisees aware of this is how the system works, but also find ways to support them to push up against this and to push up against this ourselves. So for example, for me, this looks like I'm only thinking about targeting journals to publish my research where they're open to the modes of writing that I want to pursue. And if that means that I'm not publishing in, the high impact, I don't know, like environment and planning or something like that, then that's what that means. But I can't contort myself any further in order to get, I've lived my whole life and people understand me when I speak. And I want people to understand me. I don't want to just be legible to particular academic audiences. I want to be legible. I do a lot of work, a lot of research with an NGO in Accra, Ghana. I have friends in Accra, Ghana. I have friends who are not academics. I want these individuals to be able to engage with my work and to say, you know what, Victoria, that's a good idea. Actually, no, Victoria, I didn't like that idea. If they can't even engage with the work, then who are we having conversations with? For me, it also comes down to that. Like, who do we want our work to be in conversation with? And I think it's so much of it comes down to voice, and we have to find ways to recognize the system, prepare individuals for the system and the feedback that they may be receiving, but also be pushing back against this as well. I think it's a really excellent question. It's not easy. I'm not trying to say this like it's easy, but I think we have to, personally, I think we have to move away from sort of inclusion in terms of let's help you to fit into this system and to find ways to actually challenge the system itself. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I can see Sam. Sam, are you still there? Did you want to ask your question directly?
Hi. I mean, I think it's the same question as has just been asked, really. I'm in the international development department at Reading, and I'm often asked. Well, PhD students are often asked by their supervisors to come to me for advice on writing and editing on writing and things like that. And I always try to. The approach I've always tried to do is to help people make their arguments clear in the style in which they are already writing, rather than changing the style. And I guess I was similar to the question you've just answered. I was asking whether that was the most appropriate way to do it, or whether it was better to kind of help people to fit into the existing structure. But yeah, I thought your answer to the last question was really nice on that point.
Thank you for that, because you've also if I can just add something, you also make me think about, thank you so much for what you just said, because it makes me think about, essentially I take a Black feminist approach in my work. I'm trying to embrace anti-colonial approaches. And so this includes not just in terms of how I'm asking research questions. It's not just in terms of who I see myself working with when I'm going to Accra and designing research projects. It also is critically in terms of writing. Anti-colonial movements and processes have always been grounded in reading and writing together. And so how do we think about, when we're talking about feminist modes of production, anti-colonial modes of production, opening challenging the system, opening things up, because it's not just about, I think sometimes it's academics, and I don't want to generalize to anyone in particular, but I think it's really easy to think about, taking these sort of critical modes of doing our research when it comes to asking the questions and doing the research. But how do we take this all the way through to the writing and sharing of our research? And so then it forces us to think about, actually, writing is not the only way of sharing our academic knowledge as well, right? I think it forces us to ask a lot of questions about the structure of academia itself and where we place validity on knowledge.
Thanks, Victoria. But Bolanley, do you want to go and ask your question? I see you've got your hand up. Bolanley?
You're muted.
Oh.
I thought I clicked on both icons at the same time. I just said hi Victoria. Really loved the presentation, and hi everyone. I'm not from geography either. I'm from law, and well, obviously, I'm not from around here, and I've experienced what you're saying on different levels. And I remember that I just had not a supervisory meeting, but a monitoring panel meeting where we had to, evaluate the work that had been turned in by a PhD student who was international. And it wasn't, so on very many levels, it just was not acceptable. Right. Now, I was the Black person. I hate calling myself Black, I'm Nigerian. I was the Black person on the panel, and there was another white person on the panel. And if the white person perhaps had been the only one, then it might be because the person was livid, actually. And I was utterly confused by what had been presented anyway. And it would have come across as perhaps aggressive, and it might be interpreted in racial terms. But it really wasn't. It was that the person had no understanding of what the remit was, of what the requirements were. There is the I want to speak in the language that I like. There is and in the style that I like. There is the, if you want to create a methodology, then you create a methodology in a way that people can understand that you're creating a methodology, and you express that clearly, and then people can judge based on those terms. These are very separate things, and it is important to give depth sometimes to these experiences and to these conversations. It's important to separate out these issues, because of course I was encouraged to speak to the student because the student was devastated, and the student kept insisting that they were picked because they're one of the most brilliant people where they're from, and this is the style. Half of the thesis was going to talk about history of something that could not be mapped, because every jurisdiction had something similar, and you just could not say that this is where it came from. So the history is good for their knowledge. It has nothing to contribute to the PhD, and that's half the PhD in the bin. So that could not be done, and they had to accept that. It didn't come easy to them, but perhaps maybe because it came from me as a Black person to explain what my own experiences had been as well during my PhD, going, well, you had to go to certain processes till you got to a place of understanding of certain things. So there is that, and I think I would like that to be fed into the conversation. But the other part is a question for you. So again, I'm learning about race, or I've been learning about race over the past few years because I lived in Nigeria. Race was not an issue. And one question I have is, so we know that these are the challenges that geography students and many other students have faced. Would it add anything to the research to interview perhaps the supervisors, the white supervisors as well, to understand what their own perhaps point of view is, what their own reservations have been, what their own perhaps experiences have been as well? Because I think that in this debate is often a misunderstanding and lots of underlying assumptions. And again, I say that as an outsider looking in. I know that there is racism. I know I've experienced it, but I also know that there's a lot of misunderstanding and lots of unspoken assumptions as well in these interactions. And so it's necessary, I think, to add some depth to the conversation so that a fuller picture is reflected.
Thank you for your comment and your question. I'm a little bit wary of talking about it in terms of depth, because I think when this research project was conceptualized, again, this was a small grant from the Royal Geographical Society. This was already tailored around interviewing 10 individuals. And this is about understanding Black individuals' supervision experiences. So already within the remit of the project, it's not about understanding experiences of Blackness in terms of the PhD process. It's about understanding Black individuals, Black PhD researchers' experiences, Black supervisors' experiences in terms of supervision. So one could pursue, for example, a doctoral research project or another sort of project looking and asking lots of different individuals, and it could be expanded to race, or other sort of elements. But in terms of this specific research project, it wasn't about understanding white supervisors' experiences of supervising a Black PhD student. It was about asking Black PhD students, what's your experience? And it was about asking Black PhD supervisors, what's your experience? When it comes to that aspect of writing, thank you for all of your comments. I think that's really important. As I'd said, this is about, there are so many ways to write English. You know this. We know there's Nigerian English, there's Ghanaian English. I'm used to writing, I grew up in the US, I'm used to US English, there's UK English. And so it's interesting about already within these different dialects of English, there are already different norms and ways of communicating and things like that. We come from different places we've studied previously. Not all of us who are here in the UK have studied in the UK previously. So there are even different ways of approaching writing a master's thesis. I would call it a master's thesis, or a PhD, a master's dissertation or a PhD thesis. Even by discipline, it can differ extensively, right? So I think, yes, there are all of these things, but that definitely doesn't take away from individual. For me, there's a difference between, somebody had talked about helping individuals to get their argument across. There are so many ways to think about it in terms of, like if your argument, we're academics. We're developing our arguments. If your argument is not clear, then obviously you need a little bit of work and support. That's completely different from the voice that you use to write that thesis, right? I see that as two very, very different things. If structurally, in terms of your argument, in terms of your points, in terms of your evidence, that's not coming through, then of course, yes, then we need a lot of work. If you've structured your thesis or your master's dissertation in such a way that, hey, this is about 50% history, and that's not going to be convincing in terms of the norms or the ways that we need to communicate this in terms of the requirements for the department, of course, yes, then the person will have to go back and restructure that accordingly. But that, to me, is not about voice. That's still, it is about the writing process. But when we're talking about voice, we're talking about, we all know there's an academic voice, right? And then there's a way that, for example, I previously studied journalism. So I know there's journalistic voice, there's narrative voice that you oftentimes read when you're reading books, there's academic voice, right? The fact that you have to write in that academic voice in order to be seen, in order for that knowledge that you're communicating to be valid, that's what we're talking about. And that's the struggle that often comes up again, that a lot of PhD researchers or Black PhD researchers within this project were talking about in terms of their own challenges. So I think, just as you said, there's a lot of different dimensions to this. But when we were talking about this in different interviews, we were talking about this in terms of the voice. But I think, as you pointed out, it is really interesting to think about, and I think it's really important, about every research project has its own sort of epistemological leaning, right? That informs the methodology and all of this. What would it look like to support students in saying, hey, if that's the way that you want to write, think about this as part of your epistemology. Think about this as part of your methodology. And that becomes a way of validizing their work instead of saying, you need to write in this particular way so that it can be accepted. So actually, I feel like thank you for your comments, because you've added to the conversation in the sense of how do we find ways to support students and bring that in and helping them to argue this as part of their case, as part of their entire thesis argument or their master's argument. So thank you.
If I could just add to that, because again, for me, that would be, oh, how do we communicate to the students? I was more looking at how do we communicate to the supervisors that they need to broaden their own skills to recognize what is going on and how to communicate more effectively what is necessary. That's the angle I wanted to bring in. So it was not to say, well, the work was incomplete, it was great. I was just thinking, okay, where do we go from here? But yeah, I think
I'm sorry I misunderstood. I'm sorry.
Into,
but can I just say one thing, other thing that you got me thinking about, so thank you for your very generative comments, is, you know, we're here in the UK, at UK universities, obviously this is online, so other people watch us as well, but there is this larger question of, you know, when you're bringing students from all over the world, how is this not shaping the ways that we also recognize knowledge and ways of writing? When you're bringing students from Nigeria, from Ghana, from the US, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then from my own personal experience, seem to be trying to funnel them into a particular mode of writing. There's something actually very colonial about that. How, if we're opening up this UK university to the entire world, then the UK university should be opening up, not the students. Or maybe both should be opening up. I would love to see, you know, the Nigerian English flavor within a thesis. Do you know what I mean? Or the Ghanaian English flavor within a thesis. I deliberately, within my department, I have written my thesis in US English because I said, I'm not going to write in UK English. I've spent X number of years writing really beautiful in US English. I would have to find a proofreader to make sure that my UK English would be correct, and I wasn't ready to expend that amount of money. But this was something that I actually had to take up within the Faculty of Research Services within my university. I had to get it approved because within the university's own guidelines, they had not specifically stipulated that your thesis had to be written in UK English. I was able to do this, right? But it's one little way that we can sort of find these cracks and like push up against the system that I think is important.
Alice.
Thank you, Bolani, for making that expansion. But I also wanted to ask Victoria on this basis that most of the writing and everything that you're talking about, the ultimum is a PhD student, black or white, you have to get a job when you finish. And that's the reason why you find conformity has been happening for a long time. It has become institutionalized because one way or the other, if you don't do that, you don't get a job. If you don't publish, you don't get a job. If you don't write the right way, you don't get a job. And the other things that you also mentioned is that within the institute, supervisors have to make sure that they introduce you along the way for things that are supposed to be there, like going to conferences where you're supposed to network and all that. And it seems like it's not happening through the research that you're doing. So how can this be changed? Because honestly, it's been going on, and that's why you find there's no professionals, not only in geography, but in different disciplines that are Black, because most of them can't find jobs because they haven't done the proper things that are supposed to be done in institute. Can we expand on this and discuss how this can be done?
Alice, you've come with big questions. I mean, to be honest, I'm still trying to, this wasn't, you know, within the research project, we didn't directly have answers for this. I myself, in my, you know, just finished my 4th year now, waiting for my Viva, I'm still trying to understand this. But I know that things like, you know, so let me just say that Alice and I are in this collective, Global Black Geographies. And like things like that, where we have other Black geographers, people from different locations in the world, we're all here studying in the UK. I know that for me, things like that have been pivotal in terms of finding opportunities. It was literally through this connection within this Global Black Geographers collective that I connected with Patricia Knox Solo in the first place. Otherwise, she never would have known who I was. I might not have known who she was. So I feel like for me, my first step is finding these different spaces in which to build these relations. I'm not going to wait for my supervisors to, I think it's important to demand this of our supervisors, to ask and demand this for our supervisors. I need connections. Can you connect me with individuals who are working in this area that I'm interested in? Do you know anyone? Can you send some emails? Can you send some email introductions? I'm going to this conference. Can you connect me with people? That sort of thing. Or to say, how do I approach individuals? If you don't know anyone, how do you recommend that I approach individuals? Writing them an email? Can you read the email before so that it seems appropriate? How do I connect with this? Because there's a whole other element of finding ways to network that also doesn't get explained. It's part of this sort of hidden curriculum. No one ever explains how to do this, but you're expected to have to do this, and you need to be able to do this in order to survive in academia. So I don't know the answers, but I think building connections, building relations, learning from those ahead of us is pivotal. Yeah. Thank you so much. I don't know if anyone if maybe other people have better suggestions, they can write it in the chat. I would love to learn as well.
Thank you, Victoria, for all your suggestions and your ideas, and the research that you've done provides huge insights into the Black PhD researcher experience, both as a researcher and as a supervisor. And I think for me, there are a number of takeaways, but the three that sort of stand out are the looking at individuals in a holistic way. And I think your point of where people have come from, the experiences that they bring to their PhD are really important to acknowledge and incorporate. I think as you talk about in terms of your, the writing and using your voice. The other thing, the academic language, it kind of ties into that. I think that's as a barrier to succeeding in a PhD or in a research process. I think that's something that I'm from Canada, so I have the same sort of UK English and Canadian English, and they're different, and it's trying to figure out how to fit that in, I think. And then the other thing that I think is really important to think about is the idea that it starts long before you actually start your PhD. That we're looking at undergraduates and masters, and there are things that can be done all along the way to make the experience of a PhD more successful and more for everybody. I'm just managing the chat to making sure there's no. I think we were due to wrap up at about 1:15. So if there's, I'm just looking, there aren't any more questions. So just before we close off, I'd just like to say thanks to Alice for organizing and inviting Victoria to come and speak with us. I think we've all probably got a lot to reflect on and think about how we can move forward with the conversations. And I think in some of the comments in the chat were about having honest conversations between PhD researchers and supervisors. And I think that's a really important, critical element to moving forward, and a really good starting point for any further work. So I think without any, Alice, do you have anything you'd like to add? Or Victoria, any last comments?
No, thank you so much, Victoria, for coming in. I think Gundula, who is the lead in our school here, and we have, of course, Bolani, who is also the BME network, to also take this discussion further within the school so that it's discussed not only in departments, but widely about these things that you have brought in. It's not only geography discipline, but it's wild in the university, so that these conversations can continue within the university, and there's racism and all these other things are part of their strategy now. And we have a new appointed person, Paul, so that those who are of influence here, some of us as students, can go ahead and have these proper discussions for actions. I think the most important thing is the action more than anything else, and having the conversations in a continuous way to improve the quality of supervision, let alone talk about racism itself. And thank you for everybody for coming, and the conversations will continue.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now. And we will let you